Good morning to one and all. Welcome to an hour-long lecture on T.S. Eliot. We're going to look at two of his major poems, Geron Shin and Journey of the Magi. But in order to do that, we should have to place him in a particular time and place. My dear students, you know that T.S. Eliot is one of the most important voices of 20th century. What did he do that made him such an important name, that gave him such an important place? I'm sure all of you know that he was not merely a poet. He was a critic and he was a dramatist too. T.S. Eliot, Thomas Sterne Eliot. Let us look at the age in which he lived, the 20th century. First slide, please. He lived from 1888 to 1965. 20th century remembers him with great pride and concern. In fact, in the beginning of the century, when he began writing, that is in the second decade and the third decade, of course he continued to write till the 1950s. To be able to write like Eliot was the aim, ambition, hope, desire of each poet. He had set a standard which every poet wanted to understand, to be able to imitate in order to be accepted and appreciated. In order to understand the poetry of the 20th century, let us first look at the characteristics of the 20th century. The 20th century was a total breakaway from the Victorian age. I'm sure, my dear students, you do know that each age is in a sense a reaction against the previous age. So if the 20th century is a breakaway from the Victorian age, we must quickly try and remember the characteristics of the Victorian age. The Victorian age was one of authority. The Victorian age was one of compromise. What happens to 20th century? What is the change? Suddenly, there is a mood of pessimism. There is a mood of skepticism. There is a mood of uncertainty. Literature cannot move away from the society in which it lives, in which it is born, in which it thrives. Literature is a product of the social, political, and economic conditions of that particular age, of that particular country. Do you remember what happened from 1914 to 1919, and again from 1939 to 1944? The two world wars which shattered human faith in humanity. Eliot was a product of this age, and therefore there was a sense of pessimism in all that he wrote. But before I come to Eliot, let us once again look at the characteristics of the age. There was a voice of authority, the voice of the expert. He wanted to be heard, and he spoke loud and clear. The two world wars I've already mentioned. This was also the age of interrogation, of questioning, not of silent acceptance, but of questioning everything around us. You know that this is what further on in the century led to the independence of many nations in many parts of the world. Next slide, please. Let us now look at 20th century poetry. I talked about the two world wars, and that gave rise to what has probably been considered a new genre in poetry, in English poetry. No, I would say in poetry all over the world. And we call this poetry war poetry. Why am I using the word war poetry? Because this poetry was inspired by war. But my dear students, I want you to understand that this war poetry was different from the poems on war that had been written in earlier centuries. And what was the major difference? In earlier centuries, it was poets who had never experienced war, who were writing about the bravery, the courage, the heroism, the patriotism of soldiers. But in 20th century, suddenly, it was the soldiers themselves who were writing about poetry. If you have stood in the line of battle, if you have faced gunfire, if you have seen your companions die before your eyes, if you have had to leave the injured and go away because the enemy is after you, then the kind of poetry that is written is very different from the poetry that was written earlier when people sat in their drawing rooms and wrote about battle scenes. And therefore this poetry of Rupert Brooke and Owen, and even Yeats to some extent, is very different from the earlier poetry on war. There is a feeling of anti-romanticism in this period. Romanticism, my dear students, you know, the characteristic features of the Romantic age, where there was imagination, where there was subjectivity. There is anti-romanticism because we are moving towards realism. What one would say, let's call a spade a spade. If life is not beautiful, if life is ugly, let us have the courage to describe it. This is what 20th century poets believed, and this is what we see in the poetry of the 20th century. There was a concern with form. When I use the word form, I'm sure you know that we are talking about the structure of a poem. There were periods in English literature where form and structure took precedence over theme or content, like in the neoclassical age, in the poetry of Alexander Pope. But in the Romantic age, there was a total breakaway. And then the Victorian age, and now I'm talking about the 20th century, where there was this concern with form. And when I say concern with form, what I mean is that there was this ability, this capability, this talent to experiment with form. Most of the poets of the 20th century, whether you're thinking of Yeats or you're thinking of Eliot or you're thinking of Hopkins, did not accept the earlier accepted traditional forms of poetry. They experimented with form. There is a complexity to the poetry of the 20th century. Earlier, particularly in the Romantic age, we believed that poetry was for pleasure. One read poetry for entertainment. But Eliot and Yeats and Hopkins, the three names I'm mentioning again, wrote a kind of poetry which was no longer pleasure. It was hard work. It was cerebral. One had to make an effort to be able to understand and appreciate this poetry. It did not appeal to the senses. It did not appeal to the heart. It was complex. It was intellectual. The next point, as you notice, is the intellectual slant that the poetry of this period had. Let us now look at the writings of Eliot. My dear students, I have tried to put it in chronological order to give you an idea of what Eliot was writing. Let's have a quick look and see what it is that he was writing. What form did he write about? What form did he use in his writings? If you notice, he started writing at a very early age. He started writing when he was in his 20s. And what did he write? In the earlier ages, in the earlier period of his life, he wrote poetry. He wrote some of his best poems even as early as the first decade and the second decade. Go on till you come to 1921 to 25, and you notice that he wrote one of his most important poems, The Wasteland. I'll talk about it a little later. And then we move on and see that in the decade of the 1930s, he started writing criticism. What sort of a critic was he? Very different from Matthew Arnold. Very different from the other critics that you have probably studied in literature. Different from Sidney and Coleridge and Dryden and Wordsworth and so on and so forth. His criticism is different. And then you notice that in 1935 to 1939, that period, he started writing his plays. We talk about his plays as being important in 20th century literature because Eliot once again went back to what is called poetic drama. You remember the Elizabethan period, my dear students, where all drama was written in poetry. Remember, the novel or the prose form was yet to get a particular shape. The novel in the 18th century. Of course, there were essays before the poetic drama of Shakespeare and other Elizabethan dramatists. But in the 20th century, Eliot went back because he thought poetry was the best form in which to write drama. You have his plays like Murder in the Cathedral, which takes us back to the time of Beckett. You have plays like The Family Reunion or The Cocktail Party, which are based in the 20th century. And he continued to write till 1959, though of course he died in 1965. Let's look at the next slide, where I've quickly tried to tell you what were the 3 stages as a critic that we see in the writings of Eliot. Pick up any history of literature book, my dear students, and you will find that Eliot's contribution to English criticism, to literary criticism, is indeed great. You must have heard of terms like tradition and individual talent. You must have heard of terms like objective, correlative. But since I'm going to be talking about poetry, I will not be spending much time on talking about his critical views. However, I would like to talk about the 3 stages that we see in the criticism of Eliot. In the first stage, he seemed to be in an Arnold-like sweep, taking entire English literature in his purview and almost demolishing all the earlier dead poets. He wrote about many of the poets, which you will read when you look at Eliot as a critic. In the second stage, the second phase of his writing as a critic, we notice that there is an interest in political and theological issues. And in the third stage, he recognizes and reaffirms old preferences for values. I've already mentioned tradition and individual talent, where Eliot talks about the importance of tradition in every individual writer. But at the same time, he reminds us that the moment there is a writing, that writing becomes a part of tradition. So between tradition and individual talent, it is a constant give and take. No writer can write without tradition, and every writer's individual talent in the long run affects tradition. And of course, his importance in introducing poetic drama again in the 20th century. Let's look at the next slide, where I've just tried to give you an idea of his major poems. You know, trying to talk about the major poems of Eliot in such a short time is trying, as one would say in the proverbial way, is trying to take the entire ocean into a teacup. I know how impossible the task is, but what I hope to be able to do is to at least whet your curiosity so that you go back to the library, you go back to your classroom and try and find out what these major poems are. I've just mentioned a few poems, my dear students. The Wasteland, as I mentioned earlier, is one of his most important contributions to 20th century poetry. The Wasteland. Please remember, it's not the Westland. We are not talking about a land in the western part of the world or the country. We are talking about this earth, which, according to Eliot, has become barren, has become incapable of producing anything. He's not talking about the earth per se. He's talking about human beings also, who seem to have lost their ability to think, to produce, to create. Both physically and mentally, they seem to have become totally barren. Of course, there's going to be more of it when we look at Geron Shin. Isn't it interesting to imagine that a writer like T.S. Eliot was not very sure about the Wasteland when he first wrote it, and then he sent it to the great American writer Ezra Pound for his approval, for his suggestions. And Ezra Pound used the proverbial pen and slashed many parts and suggested changes. So the Wasteland that we see today, that is available for us readers, is what has been corrected. And if to use computer language, has been deleted. Parts of it deleted by Ezra Pound. But the Wasteland is certainly one important piece of writing of Eliot. What is the Wasteland about? Impossible to give you in a sentence. The allusions, the anthropology, the myth, the readings of Eliot, his constant touch with Fraser's Golden Bough, his readings of Hinduism and Buddhism and Christianity and what have you, all that comes across in the Wasteland. A very difficult poem, but at the end of it, when he concludes with Om Shanti, one feels that this poem has really achieved something great. There are also other poems that one has to look at, like the love song of Alfred J. Prufrock. Can you imagine? He's writing about an old man. The persona is an old man. Eliot is only in his 20s, but he's writing about the experiences of a 60-year-old man. It's easy to write about a 20-year-old when you're 60 because you've already experienced it. But here you have a 20-year-old man writing about a 60-year-old. I want you to understand the imagination, the imaginative ability to create a persona who has experienced something which our young poet has not yet experienced. That is the greatness of T.S. Eliot as a poet. Irony plays a major role in most of the poems of T.S. Eliot. And that, my dear students, brings me to the first poem that I'm going to discuss with you today. Geron Shin. The word itself is something which puts you into a tizzy because you don't know what it is all about. What is Geron Shin? Is it a name? I've never heard the name, is what you're probably telling yourself. Yes, we have not heard the name because it is actually a Greek word. Geron means a small old man, and from that he has created the name Geron Shin. What is the poem about? It is, let me begin with the form and tell you that it is a monologue. You all know the word dialogue, my dear students, but I'm sure you've heard of the monologue too. You've probably heard of a literary form called the dramatic monologue, which was made very popular by writers like Browning in the Victorian age. You have probably heard of how in the dramatic monologue, one speaker at a dramatic moment in his life is talking to others, but the others do not speak. How then do you know that there are listeners? Because the speaker, in the course of his monologue, gives you the reactions of the listeners too. So what is Geron Shin? I just said it's a monologue. But my dear students, it's not a dramatic monologue. It is an interior monologue. That means the character, the persona, Geron Shin, is speaking to himself. I'm sure you've seen this in modern movies where you have one character in black and the same character in a white dress. And this is what is happening inside the mind of the character. This is what the poet is trying to do. The entire form of the poem, as we go along with the poem, you'll see, is what is called, written in what is called verse libre. Let me translate it to you. It just means free verse. What does that mean? That stanzas do not have a fixed structure. It's not a quatrain, it's not a couplet, it's not a sestet, it's not a tercet. Look at it any way, but it seems as if Eliot writes in any way he pleases. The structure, the form of the poem is what you can call verse libre or free verse. What is the writer talking about? He's talking about his failure. He's talking about his failure. But his failure is actually representative of the futility of life in contemporary society. Throughout the poem, Eliot shows us how much he has read. The depth and breadth of his reading strikes you in every poem of his, because the allusions, my dear students, would need a great deal of reading. Maybe many times as we read the poem, we can only guess at the allusions. Maybe many times the allusions are there. Many times your teachers will help you understand the allusions. And many times we may have to go to critics of T.S. Eliot's poems in order to be able to understand what it is all about. For students who are interested in knowing more about Eliot, I would suggest that you should look at books like 20th Century Interpretations, where there is a collection of different critics, and you would come to know what the poem is all about. Throughout the poem, the symbolism that we come across is one of rain, as well as contrasted with drought. Rain as the life giver and drought as the life taker or the life killer, because during drought, nothing can grow. Remember, my dear students, we are not looking at only the natural phenomena of rain and drought. We are looking at the human being with his ability to produce. Produce what? I shall talk about it later. And also the inability to produce. What one in modern psychology talks about, the drying up. Suddenly there is a drying up, or it could be a gradual drying up, and the human being becomes incapable of writing anything, of producing anything. There is a sense of inevitable decay. I'm going to do the poem with you in detail, and therefore please see on the screen the lines of the poem which I shall be explaining to you. Thou hast not youth nor age, but as it were an after-dinner sleep, dreaming of both. Can I have the slide, please? What we are looking at here is that there is only dreaming of both. What is this both? Both mind and body. Both the mind and the body, both mental action and physical action are not possible for Geron Shin and for modern man. Thou hast, now this is from Measure for Measure by Shakespeare. This is the epigram before the actual poem begins. One wonders, is the poet speaking to Geron Shin? Is Geron Shin speaking to us? Is Geron Shin speaking to listeners? No way in which we can make out. We have to guess, and it has to be a sensible guess. It has to be an intellectual guess. Probably it is the poet who is telling Geron Shin that he is incapable of both physical and mental action. When Eliot was writing this poem, my dear students, actually he was lecturing on Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. And therefore, in the course of this poem, we see a great deal of reference to both the Elizabethan and the Jacobean plays and drama. Eliot did not take away from his teachings to sit and write. He did both simultaneously. Let's look at the next slide. Here I am, an old man in a dry month, being read to by a boy waiting for rain. My dear students, I mentioned to you that rain is anything that can produce life. So when you are probably wanting to take an examination, ideas must come to your mind so that you can write the answers, right? So in the same way, when there is a poet, he needs ideas. When you have to create something, if you are a scientist, you need ideas. So here, waiting for rain indicates the waiting for inspiration, the waiting for ability to be able to do something, to produce physically or mentally. What is it that Geron Shin is talking about? He is now an old man. He is now incapable of action. But I want you to understand, my dear students, that according to Eliot, it is not as if Geron Shin is incapable of action today because he is old. No. Geron Shin was never capable of action. And now, as an old man, when he sits waiting for rain, he looks back at his life and realizes, even when he was physically fit, even when he was young, even when he was in the prime of his life, he was incapable of any action. I talked about the breadth and depth of Eliot's reading. So when he talks about hot gates, I was neither at the hot gates. What is he talking about? He's talking about a war, a Greek war in ancient Greece, takes us somewhere to 380 BC. But then he links it to his present. And what is his present? Eliot tried very hard to enlist as a soldier in the World War, but he was not accepted as a soldier. And therefore, Eliot is probably putting his experiences in the mouth of Geron Shin when he says that he did not fight in the warm rain. What is it that the life of a soldier is like? Look at the words, my dear students. Nor fought in the warm rain, nor knee-deep in the salt marsh, heaving a cutlass, bitten by flies, fought. You know that the life of a soldier is not an easy life. And he could not do all this. He wanted to act, but he was incapable of action. Who? Geron Shin, the persona, and the poet Eliot. Remember that the persona is different from the poet. This is not an autobiographical poem, but the poet obviously brings in some of his experiences into the poem. And then he says, my house is a decayed house. I mentioned to you even earlier that this concept of decay, barrenness, disintegration, nihilism almost is there in most of Eliot's poems. And the decayed house that he's talking about here is the human body. He believes that his body, Geron Shin's body, modern contemporary man's body, is like a decayed house. Decay, my dear students, please remember, is a process of disintegration. It's not death. It's not destruction. I think these are better because these are probably sudden. But decay indicates a process of slow disintegration and ruin. And therefore, he talks of his house being a decayed house. And the Jew squats on the windowsill. The owner spawned in estaminet of Antwerp, blistered in Brussels, patched and peeled in London. Antwerp, Brussels, London, my dear students, you know that these are important trading commercial centers in Europe. They were, and they still are. Antwerp, my dear students, you know, is the hub of diamond industry. And we in Gujarat certainly know about Antwerp. Now, he's talking about these trading centers. Why does he mention these cities? Probably because he is worried that the only power that is respected in the world today is the power of money. And therefore, he is mentioning these urban centers. He talks about the Jew squats on the windowsill because the Jews have been associated with money lending, with commerce, right from the days of Shakespeare, the Elizabethan age. Remember, for students of literature, all of us know of Shylock, the Jew, the money lender. He goes on, after talking about the commercial power of the world, to the situation, the psychological landscape today. What is it like? The goat coughs at night in the field overhead. Rocks, moss, stone crop, iron merds. The woman keeps the kitchen, makes tea, sneezes at evening, poking the peevish gutter. Look at these 4 lines, my dear students. There isn't one positive word. There isn't one bright word. There isn't one word to cheer us up. Because this is what Eliot believed was the condition of contemporary society. 20th century society, according to him, had a landscape of aridity and desolation, which comes across again and again in every poem of his. Let us look at the slide. What does he say? What does Geron Shin say? I am an old man, a dull head among windy species. Signs are taken for wonders, we would see a sign. We are waiting. Hindus talk about the Dashavatara, and we talk about waiting for Kalki. So too does the Christian poet talk about waiting for a miracle. Will Christ come down again, or will he send us a sign? And therefore he says, we would see a sign. It is also a reference to man's innate questioning ability. No, I wouldn't even call it an ability. I would call it a fault, a defect. Even when the miracle is in front of you, you ask, is it true that it is a miracle? Is it true that this is God? Is it true that this is God's representative? This is what worries Eliot when he says that we do not want to accept. We would see a sign. We ask for a sign, a proof that it is a miracle, a proof that it is divinity speaking to us. I'll talk about it later when we talk about journey of the Magi. And therefore, he says in spring, we hope that we will see Christ again. In the juvenescence of the year, juvenescence is spring, came Christ the tiger. Tiger. All those pictures that you've seen of Christ, all those descriptions that you have seen of Christ, Christ is always calm, peaceful, with absolutely no indication of any anger in him. Why then is Christ being compared to the tiger? My dear students, do you remember Blake? Do you remember Blake's poems on the tiger, tiger, tiger burning bright? And then the poem on the lamb, where he talks about both the wrathful aspect as well as the calm, peaceful aspect of God. And here, Eliot is talking about the wrathful aspect. Because if Christ were to come down again, he cannot come in the form in which he came earlier. 20th century demands, needs, requires the wrath of God. And therefore, he talks of Christ as coming as the tiger. Some of you might recall Eliot's poem where he talks about the same thing, where he talks about slouching towards Bethlehem. It's the same idea that we find in the Irish poet W.B. Yeats. Let's continue with the poem, my dear students. It's a long poem, but I hope you are with me, understanding what Eliot is doing in this poem, pointing out to us the barrenness that is associated with 20th century in the mind of every thinking individual. And Eliot certainly was a thinking individual. We continue with the same idea of depraved May, dogwood, chestnut, flowering Judas. Judas, of course, you remember, is the one who gave away Christ when they were at the Last Supper. And then you've got names. You've got Mr. Silvero. You've got Limoges. You've got... What are all these names? He just takes random names. I don't think they refer to any particular character. They are just random names. But my dear students, I want you to understand. I want you to realize that all the names that he uses are urban names. Because this entire concept of barrenness, this entire concept of the world being a wasteland, this entire concept of disintegration and decay and depravity, all that in Eliot's mind, as in the minds of many 20th century writers, is associated with the concept of urban life. You go back to rural life, you can once again say beauty, simplicity, innocence, etc. All these that Eliot is writing about refer to the urban landscape. It is the urban landscape, and therefore the names that Eliot uses are all urban names. What are we looking for? We are looking for some sort of salvation. And where do we go for salvation? Maybe we go to the painters. Maybe we go to the writers. And therefore, when he talks about the Titians, he is talking about the paintings which were very popular in his days. He's talking about those. What is he like? An old man. Let me read the line before that. I have no ghosts. Because I've not done anything. I have never acted. I've been incapable of action. So what ghosts can I have? You know, Eliot surprisingly seems to suggest that it is better to commit a crime than not to act at all. Because if you've committed a crime, or if you've participated in the war, if you have killed enemy soldiers, probably the ghosts of those soldiers will come to haunt you in your old age. But then you didn't do anything. You were incapable of action. So how can you have any ghosts, because you've never acted even when you were young? And therefore Eliot, Geron Shin, the persona says, I have no ghosts. And what am I like? An old man in a drafty house under a windy knob. And then he goes on with, after such knowledge. What is this knowledge? Is there any knowledge? Or is it a perversion of knowledge? He goes on with that. And the poem continues to have that dominant tone of menace and intrigue and horror and disintegration. The problem is there is no thought, there is no action. Eliot is certain that you cannot have action without thought. You cannot have thought without action. It's a long poem, my dear students. Let's quickly reach the conclusion where he talks about the tiger, he talks about death, and then tenants of the house, thoughts of a dry brain in a dry season. You'll have to go back and read the poem to see the kinds of figures of speech that he uses. If you notice in the second line on the screen, my dear students, chilled delirium is a wonderful example of an oxymoron. Because delirium is when you have high fever. And that time the body should be hot. But here he's talking about chilled delirium. You have the oxymoron. You have all these proper names that are referred to. You have reference to Tennyson's Ulysses, who wanted to act, and Geron Shin, who is incapable of acting. You've got Dante's Beatrice, who is able to accept all her guilt. And here you have Geron Shin, who is constantly trying to be in a process of self-justification. I could go on and on, my dear students, but I realize that I shall have to talk about another important poem, which is what we are now going to do, and that is the journey of the Magi. Let me tell you in a minute what it all is about. A journey, of course, you know. Who are the Magi? Very quickly, let's go back to Christ's birth in Bethlehem. Let's go back to the 3 wise men. Different stories have different interpretations. Were they kings? Were they wise men? Were they common people? We are not going to go into all those detailed interpretations. But according to Eliot, they were the Magi. And who are the Magi? Magus is a Greek word, which means wise man. And the plural of that is Magi. You know, this kind of plural is gradually dying out in the English language. But some of you might remember that the plural of radius is radii, the plural of focus is foci, and so on. The plural of stadium is stadii. I could go on and on with these unusual plurals. The English language has taken these words from other languages, Greek, Latin, French, whatever. And then what the English language has done, it has retained the original plural form. Okay? And that is why the Magi, the plural form of the word magus, which means wise man. There were 3 wise men, remember? They saw a star. They were led by the star to Bethlehem. And they reached Bethlehem and found that a child has been born in a manger. The child, later on, who would be known as Jesus Christ. This poem traces the journey of the Magi. It is again a monologue. One of the wise men is later on speaking about his experiences. He's describing what happened during the journey, the physical journey. But I cannot just stop with the physical journey, because it is also a poem about the mental journey. And therefore, I shall try to explain to you what this king, this Magi, this magus, because I imagine it is one who is speaking about the experiences of the 3. What is it that he's talking about? How are poems written, my dear students? It's very interesting to note that Eliot actually wrote this poem as a Christmas card. One of the poems he wrote as a Christmas card for the famous publishers Faber and Faber. You might have heard of Faber and Faber. They're still an important publishing house. Eliot wrote this as a card, and later on, when he published his poems, this was also included in that collection of poems. There are many poems, of which this is one, in what we call the aerial poems. This is a physical journey. Let's look at the poem. We are describing, remember, Christ was born on the 25th of December, and therefore it is cold. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year, for a journey, and such a long journey. I want to draw your attention that the journey here is not merely the physical journey, it is also the mental journey, and therefore it is a long journey. It is winter, the worst time of the year. It was deep, the way was deep, and the weather sharp. What season is it? Let me repeat it again. The very dead of winter. An awful time to be traveling. And remember, we are talking about long, long ago, 2000 years ago. We are not talking about traveling by air-conditioned cars or planes or trains or what have you. We are talking about these people probably walking and walking and walking. And it was winter. What did they travel on? Let me remind you that Eliot is a European, is an Englishman who has also lived in the US. But he's talking about Bethlehem. And where is Bethlehem, my dear students? Please remember, we are talking about Asia. And when we are talking about Asia, what is What is the animal that comes to your mind, that part of Asia? What is the camel? An important vehicle, right? An important animal in the desert. So these people are traveling by camels. They have all kinds of problems. They have weather problems. And in addition to the weather problems, my dear students, look at the poem. And the camels, galled, sore-footed, refractory, obstinate camels. And what were they doing? They were lying down in the melting snow. It's very difficult to make this heavy animal get up, right? And they were lying down. And these poor kings, what were they doing? They kept thinking about what they had left behind. And what had they left behind? Summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, the silken girls bringing sharbat. That is the kind of life they led. And they left that life to go on a journey. What for? Where to? We still don't know, because they have not yet reached the place. So very often in the mind of these kings, probably the question arose, are we doing something which is stupid? Are we on a wild goose chase? Are we really going to find something when we reach there? This is the question that was in the mind of Eliot when he converted to the Church of England. Some of you, I'm sure, probably know about Catholicism and Protestantism. To us, many of us, they are both Christian religions. Yes, they are. But Eliot himself was unhappy with one and got baptized into the Church of England. And then there were doubts in his mind. Have I done the right thing? Should I have continued with the religion into which I was born? Or is this questioning and conversion right? Probably he places these in the minds of these three wise men as they travel to Bethlehem. The Camel Men were grumbling, running away, cursing, wanting their liquor and women. The night fires going out. And everywhere they went, did they get any help? No. The cities were hostile, the towns unfriendly, the villages dirty and charging high prices, etc. Let's come to the end of that verse where he says, with the voices singing in our ears, saying, this was all folly. When you do something different, when you attempt to do something new, when you are breaking away from tradition, there is so much to fight against. And this is what Eliot is suggesting here. Please remember that these Magi, or the Magus, they belong to a pre-Christian religion. There was no Christianity when Jesus Christ was born. So the Magus, or the Magi, were walking towards the place where Christ was born, supposed to be born, by following a star in the sky. They were attempting to do something which was different, which was new. And therefore, constantly they were being told that what they are doing is probably wrong. With voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. But they didn't stop. They continued to go. And what happened? The next verse, my dear students. At dawn, we came to a temperate valley. Now it's not so cold. Now it's not snowing. Now it's not melting snow. It's different. It's temperate valley. Eliot is probably suggesting that as they neared the place where Christ was to be born, or is born, suddenly everything changed. From the barrenness of winter, we move towards spring. We move towards life. We move towards action. Probably that is what he's suggesting. But throughout the poem, my dear students, there are so many allusions, biblical allusions, references to myths, references to Christianity, which might make it difficult for some of you to understand the poem. But try and understand the concept behind the poem. Doesn't matter if you can't understand a word. You can always look up the word in the dictionary. But with Eliot, what is important is you have to understand the substance of the poem. You have to understand the mood of the poem. You have to understand the basic premises on which the poem is based. And therefore, now as they are nearing Bethlehem, what happens, my dear students? The weather improves, but people do not improve. And feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information. Nobody still knew where Bethlehem was. Nobody knew where is the manger, where this little child is born. Nobody knew anything of that. And everybody telling them that it was wrong. But They continued. And now, after they reached the place, after whatever their experiences, today, one of the Magi is narrating his experiences. And this, my dear students, is very, very important. I want you to look at each line carefully. Let's look at the slide again. All this was a long time ago, I remember. Right? So he's talking, recounting his experiences of long, long ago. All this was a long time ago, I remember. Sometimes when someone asks you, and I'm in school you must have written essays, if I could live my life again, right? All of us have attempted an essay like that. And some of us say, if I could live my life again, I would love to live it exactly the way I lived. And some of us would say, no, I want to make these changes in my life. The Magus here is telling us, all this happened a long, long time ago, but I would do it again. If I had to live my life again, I would be ready to take on such a hazardous, dangerous, difficult, filled with all kinds of problems. I would like to take that journey again. Look at that, my dear students. The repetition, but set down this. Set down this. Right? Twice he says it. I don't want you to misunderstand me. I want to emphasize. This is what the Magus is telling us. I want you to clearly understand that if I were to be given an opportunity, I would like to do this again. But there is a doubt in my mind, says the wise man, the Magus. What does he say? Were we led all that way for birth or death? Please understand. Were we led all that way for birth or death? What was the birth? The birth of Jesus Christ, and hence the birth of Christianity. But at the same time, my dear students, there was death. You know, it's like saying that for a plant to be born, right? What happens? The seed has to die. For a chick to be born, the egg has to die. So you understand, for any birth, there has to be a death. In the same way, he says, I know it was a birth, but wasn't there a death of some kind? What is that death? My earlier religion, my beliefs, all kinds of things which were associated with my life till now, all that has to die. There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence, and no doubt. There was a birth, certainly, because we saw the child in the manger, and therefore we knew that there was a birth. We had evidence, and no doubt. I have seen birth and death, but I thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death, because a part of me has to die. In case I want to accept what is new. What is new? The religion that is going to come with the birth of Christianity. And when they come back home, all their subjects believe in the old religion. The Raja and the Praja, the king and the subjects should have the same beliefs. But here, the subjects believe in the old religion, and the kings, the Magi, the Magus, want to believe in a new religion. And therefore, what is the hope that they now have? And that is, I should be glad of another death. The death that he is talking here about is the physical death. My dear students, in the course of 1 hour, I have attempted to take you through the characteristics of 20th century, basic characteristics of the literature of the period, which were influenced by the socio-political economic conditions of the 20th century. I brought you to Eliot, who is an important voice. Very quickly, I talked about his other writings, like his plays and his criticism, brought you to his poems, and then, as representative, I took 2 of his major poems. Probably for some of you, they are prescribed in your syllabus. Maybe for some of you, you'll go back home now and read them. But remember, my dear students, reading poetry is a pleasure in itself. And I'm sure through these lectures, we hope to be able to whet your curiosity to become more appreciative of literature, not only in the English language, but literatures from all over the world. Remember, what we are doing here is only to give you an inkling, just to open maybe a box, not a Pandora's box, because all that we are giving you here is wonderful reading ability, reading scope, and increasing your interest in reading, studying, and maybe later some of you are going to become poets like T.S. Eliot. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture as much as I have enjoyed in delivering it. Happy reading and all the best for your exams. Thank you.